thank basically the army of people that have helped me along the way, starting from my mentors in undergraduate and that really got me interested in psychology and psychological research, and then my graduate mentors who facilitated that, and now my postdoctoral mentors who continue to provide research opportunities and keep me inspired in terms of clinical research. I'm also very thankful to have gotten an F-31 through NIDA, which allowed me to actually visit some of the thought leaders in the areas that I'm interested in. So I got to meet with Roy Baumeister, who's leading the way in some of the self-control strength theory that I'll talk about today, and Warren Bickel and James McKillop, who are really great with the behavioral economic type of field and measures and theoretical framework. And then Sherry McKee, who also was really big on kind of developing these addiction models to use in the lab that might mimic lapse and relapse within the real world. So I really encourage all students to think about potential funding sources while they're in graduate school, because it really opened up a lot of opportunities, not only to fund my own research and to pay for my stipend, but also to meet other people in the field and think about what the next steps might be in this research line. And then I had just an army of people that helped actually on the day-to-day running the project, and I'm incredibly grateful for them throughout. And then all my fellow graduate students and administrative coordinators that helped kind of keep the lab going and kept me inspired in times when it had the long hours and keeping me going with enthusiastic over the project. So when I think about what I'm doing, I always like to have a goal in mind, and so a very broad goal that I like to think about is how to actually change something that tends to have some negative consequences or maladaptive behavior. And so some potential ways of doing that is through new treatment development. And also more recently on my postdoctoral fellowship, I've been involved in policy-based research. So you can potentially help at a larger scale through those types of work. So I'll talk more about some of the mechanism type research that I've actually done during graduate school. And specifically focusing on some of the cues or triggers of substance use, smoking specifically, and the reinforcing effects of smoking, and how that might inform some of the treatment development and policy along the way. And I gotta click the right one there. And so this figure I also have on the right here is also to think about where I've been in my research area. So I've typically been at the level of the person, talking about their subjective experiences and their actual behaviors. And I kind of came to a junction point where I can think about, do I want to go deeper, underlying mechanisms, or do I want to go a little bit higher in terms of the environmental context and things like that? And I'll talk to you about where I'm kind of situated in that moving forward at the end. So we'll really first start off with just why study smoking and how affect is related to smoking behavior, and then kind of get into some of the self-regulation theory and the specific research questions about how self-control strength is related to smoking and how smoking might impact self-control strength. And then finish off with how I might use this to develop new treatments. So I think the question of why to study smoking is readily apparent when you look at the fact that it's the leading preventable cause of death worldwide. So currently every year about 5 million people are subject to death as a function of smoking-related illnesses. And as you can see from the Surgeon General report here, it's predicted that about 1 billion deaths will happen by the end of the century if we don't do something to curb smoking rates. So smoking actually has a wide impact on many different organ systems and is related to many different cancers outside of just the traditional ones you hear in terms of lung cancer. And so in red is highlighted some of the newer areas that smoking-related illnesses have been shown with causal links that have been in the recent Surgeon General report. But despite all these illnesses and causes of mortality and all these consequences, you can actually see from the graph on the left here that tobacco-related industries actually making about $35 billion per year, which is more than Microsoft, Coca-Cola, and McDonald's combined, just to put it in perspective. So despite all these harms and consequences, there's a lot of money being made. And then the graph on the right kind of shows that even though there's all this money, that there's actually now the Master Settlement Agreement, and there's also tobacco tax revenues, where the states get back some of the money that that people are spending on cigarettes so that they can kind of put tobacco control measures in place. But you can see that there's a very large difference between how much of that money actually goes back into tobacco control research. And that's actually one draw of Oklahoma State, is that we actually have a very conscientious tobacco research center in Oklahoma City that has a number of endowed funds that are for kind of how do we prevent this and give back to the public to prevent some of this illness. And so it's nice to see that people are pushing this kind of bar in a different direction here. But one thing to keep in mind when doing that is thinking about the history of how smoking rates have kind of been over time. So I'm not going to go through all the details of this specific slide, but the takeaway messages here is about in 1960 is when we had the highest prevalence rates of smoking in the US. So it says per capita, but that actually equates to about 64% of the US population actually smoked back before the first Surgeon General report in 1964. And then that's nicely been declining over the years, and it's largely been attributed to public policy type interventions. And more recently, we've kind of reached a prevalence rate of about 19%, and it's been fairly small in terms of the changes we've seen over the past kind of decade, which I think really shows that it's a really opportune time to develop new types of interventions, and a really exciting time because we actually have more control over some of the policy regulations as well because of the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act that was passed in 2009, which actually gave us, the FDA, the ability to regulate tobacco products. So I have another line of research that kind of looks at different alternative products like e-cigarettes or taking the nicotine out of cigarettes to potentially make it less reinforcing that I won't go into today. But it's really nice because you can kind of see from the different arrows, it's like there's many different ways that these rates could go, and we now have a lot of ability to actually impact those rates even more. And I think one area to focus on is thinking about negative affect, because despite having a really high rates of quit attempts basically over the course of one's lifetime, so actually about 80% of smokers try to quit it ever in their lifetime, 45% each year are trying to quit, but you know, when I see an outcome about only 5% of people are actually making it over the course of those quit attempts, that's a lot of room for improvement, or a lot of ways to kind of increase that. Unfortunately, only our best treatments, varenicline, and combining it with behavioral therapy, actually only gets us up to about 30%, and that's in clinical trials where we have very neat populations and not necessarily in the real world effectiveness trials, which that tends to reduce over time, the percentages there. So we definitely have areas we can step in. And when you ask smokers why they relapse, the biggest report you get is because they're stressed out, or because smoking helps them relax, or I just can't take it anymore, it's time to have that cigarette. And to kind of support that, actually, if you do EMA studies where you kind of give somebody a palm top and have them follow over time how they're feeling and prompt them randomly, you can actually see that in the 4 hours preceding a lapse, you'll see a spike in people's stress response. So it's not necessarily that they're just kind of falsely recalling it. You can prospectively predict that that's going to take place. And you can actually do some causal experimental tests within the lab where you bring people in and you actually stress them out and see what happens. Are they going to start smoking? Are they going to start administering nicotine? And they've done these in both animal and human models. So I want to talk to you about a meta-analysis I did that kind of looked at the area of research there. But before going too far with the term affect, it's a very contentious discussion of what affect is in terms of models, or even sometimes how to define it, or whether they use it interchangeably with the term emotion. But so just to tell you a little bit how I'll briefly talk about it, is basically anything on the left of this bipolar scale here that goes from activation to deactivation and pleasant or unpleasant to pleasant valence, or what some might call a circumplex model. Anything that's kind of unpleasant is going to be considered negative affect in the terms I'm using it. But there might be different types of negative affect. So if it's high activation like stress or anxiety, it might fall in that top or up left category. But sadness or depression might be a little bit different. So you might actually see different effects. Interestingly enough, in the meta-analysis that I'm about to present with over about 20 studies that have done any manipulations of negative affect, there's only been one that ever really made people sad or depressed as their manipulation. Everything else is typically a high activation distressor. And then there's only been about 11 studies that actually manipulate positive affect. So, and it's kind of muddy in terms of where it fell on those activation levels. But so there's much more going on in the negative affect world and less so in the positive affect. But what does consistently come up is when you do the meta-analysis, and basically in this fourth slide here, anything to the right of the line here, this first study was actually looking at how it might influence craving or people's self-reported desire for a cigarette. And it came out to be a medium effect size that if you basically provide people with a neutral cue versus a stressor cue, after this stressor cue, people are going to be more likely to be craving a cigarette or to report wanting a cigarette. So that's also in support of the idea that it might be something that affects their ability to maintain abstinence if they're constantly being, their subjective desires change over time as a function of these stressors. But one critique we got from this from this paper was that craving is a self-report, and this is a very valid critique. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's their actual behavior, so it might not be affecting actual smoking behavior. And so I was actually kind of honored when I got this commentary, because it was Saul Schiffman, who's like the leader in the field of kind of this negative affect and this EMA type data. So I put this up there, one, because I'm a little proud of it, too, and two, because it was a valid point. And little did Saul know that we actually had done these analyses prior to the submission of the article and put it in the article, but reviewers asked us to take it out. So it's kind of also a learning lesson of just how the review process works. And we were like, we had that data. So what we did is it's actually under resubmission now, a second paper. So although it was kind of confusing in the time, it's actually kind of nice, because now I'm going to end up with 2 publications instead of 1, but I thought it told a better story when it was just 1, regardless. So this is going to look at just the effects of these same stressors on what I'm going to call a lapse analog. So if you think about relapse or a lapse, it's kind of the first time you have a cigarette after you decide to quit. And so there's usually time from when you quit to when you actually start lapsing. So that in this model, we're looking at the latency until someone chooses to pick up a cigarette and smoke it when you place it in front of them in the laboratory context. And so if you stress somebody out versus don't do much to them and just give them a neutral cue, they're actually going to be more likely to pick that cigarette up faster and to start smoking it. So this would provide kind of analog evidence that it might increase lapse rates. And then to think about relapse, it would be how much do you keep using the product or keep smoking after you've had that first kind of use of it here. And so within the laboratory, this could be modeled as number of puffs or how much consumption they might have. Sometimes studies will just present 1 cigarette and you just kind of behaviorally look at how much they're smoking, or sometimes they'll kind of provide just like a tray of cigarettes, and they can have as many cigarettes as they want over the course of an hour, for example. And it looks like if you stress people out, they actually will smoke more during that same time than someone who is not stressed out as well. One strength of this, too, is we also had their self-report ratings of stress or negative affect, and it actually served as a moderator of these analyses. So the more stressed out people were, the more they were smoking as well. So there was a high correlation with those there. Although you might notice the effect sizes here were pretty small. This was only about 0.114 here. So they were having effects, but not huge ones. And within the context of kind of addiction theory, I like to think about the historical kind of progression of this. So originally, negative reinforcement was looking at kind of withdrawal, and was typically focused on opioids. So they would say that once you kind of develop this physical dependence, once you take the drug away, you're using the substance again because you need to change your physiological responding. But then later on in the 90s and 80s, it started being about drugs used in more of coping with other typical stressors or kind of environmental stressors, basically, even outside of just the physiological effects of the drug. And kind of the most contemporary model by Tim Baker, it's kind of a combination of these where through classical conditioning you start kind of realizing, your body recognizes that when you're in withdrawal, smoking will get rid of that withdrawal. But people start associating that negative feeling with any other stressor, so they overgeneralize the ability of smoking to regulate typical negative affective states, or that same interoceptive state, despite it actually not having much of an effect on just general environmental stressors. And the other thing is that there's kind of this conscious and preconscious component of it. So he predicts that people might start smoking before negative affect actually occurs or before withdrawal comes up. So instead of trying to dampen down the withdrawal, you kind of smoke before it happens, so you can kind of stave it away in a function. And so people can kind of learn to titrate or regulate their smoking as a function of that. And the fact that it wasn't really affecting, so there's no like consistent evidence that if you smoke after a stressor that it actually reduces stress. And so that combined with that underlying resource or this kind of unconscious processes brought me to self-regulation theory, and which broadly speaking is really just the effort to, any effort to alter any responses. So it incorporates both conscious and unconscious processes. So the fact that I'm breathing right now is self-regulation, but I'm not really thinking about taking a breath in or a breath out. But if I were to think about kind of the words I'm trying to speak as I'm speaking with you, that's me kind of consciously thinking about that. And anytime I want to try to override any sort of automatic type of behavior or some sort of urge or desire, that would require that conscious process or this effortful processing of self-control. And especially if I had a goal that I'm trying to achieve. And so there's been a number of different areas where this applies to, not just smoking, for example, but many health-related behaviors and many everyday behaviors. So there's broad applications of the self-regulation theory. And there were two primary reasons that people talked about why self-regulation might fail. Two of those being, or the two are underregulation and misregulation, which I consider kind of hard to really understand sometimes in terms of which one's happening in a different context. Because, for example, these bunnies might just not have the ability to control themselves, or they might be thinking about short-term gratification in terms and sacrificing long-term gratification, or another process that people have talked about in terms of delayed discounting. So thinking about the short-term but not the long-term. And I don't think it's necessarily clear all the time which is actually occurring unless you kind of dissect it a little bit more. But the underregulation has gotten the most, I would say, literature and research evidence in terms of the self-control strength model. And this is really focusing on not really necessarily thinking about those unconscious processes, but how much time you actually focus on the self-control in terms of effort and deliberative actions. So you're actually putting effort and thinking about it and trying to suppress those internal automatic responses. And so there's basically an energy model where you can, whether you're controlling emotions or thoughts or impulses or intention or volition, and this was attractive to me because it's kind of applying to a lot of different areas and different spheres, and no matter what they were trying to kind of control or what they were inhibiting, it all led to the same type of effects. So it was kind of this broad-based underlying resource that appears to be limited, so that if you use it on one task, you have less available for a subsequent task. So to visually depict it, you're basically at a much better state before you start anything, and then if you do anything that requires effort, you might be more susceptible to doing something impulsive afterwards. And the fact that about 200 studies supported this provided some really nice evidence. And my mentor's not in the room, but usually I'm making a joke about him when I show that slide. So I didn't know what to say on that slide today, but we worked it out. But there's a really nice paradigm to actually look at this, where you basically have two tasks. The first one is what you manipulate, and the examples in yellow are what I'm going to talk about briefly in the study I used, but basically you can present almost the exact same stimuli. So in my study, I'll I'll show the exact same video, but one group I tell to suppress how they're reacting. The other group just watches it naturally. And then everybody will do some sort of frustrating task afterwards that requires self-control to keep going. Because if you don't like tracing impossible things, you should probably just give up. But some people will persist longer. And if you actually use whatever you consider to be the self-control depleting task, they give up quicker. So I like the fact that there are kind of behavioral consequences and that you can use the exact same stimuli. So everything's the exact same except for potentially what they're doing internally. So there were a couple studies specific to substance use. And the first ones were basically looking at alcohol use. So they basically had people suppress their thoughts versus do math problems. And after they suppressed their thoughts, they were more likely to consume higher levels of alcohol. And then with smoking, they gave people really delectable foods and then some that are less appealing to people. And they just sat them in front of them for a few minutes. And they weren't allowed to eat anything. But so the fact was that they're considering that they were resisting the urge to eat these things. And then they let them go on a break. And when they came back, they did a CO monitor that detects whether they smoked or not. And there were higher percentages of people smoking if you kind of put them in this state where they were thinking about really tasty food. So the idea would be, again, that they depleted their resources and they couldn't resist cravings to smoke after that. But I thought about it as it might be more than just the inability to resist drug cravings, but perhaps they're using it as a way to kind of actually influence their self-control resources if that's what's being depleted. And there is actually a large literature on other methods that might restore self-control. So one of which are like positive affect emotion manipulations and also relaxation. Glucose is also a contentious one, especially in the literature now, because it's not just the ingestion of glucose, but even just rinsing it in the mouth can have the same types of effects. So I can talk more about that if possible later. But my kind of general thoughts are, what if smoking could kind of serve this purpose within nicotine-dependent smokers? And so my way of thinking about doing this was I want to make sure I can actually get self-control depletion in the literature, because at this point, this is my master's thesis. All I've done is read about it. I don't know if it really actually happens or how to make it happen. So I try to design a study where I could actually make it happen without smoking related to it, but then also the effects of smoking. So I did a 2x2 design. And so this on the left here would basically be replicating just the regular self-control depletion effect that has always been seen. And then if we think about this bar here with the smoking, and those depleted, bringing that bar back up would be the restoration I was talking about. But a really important part of this design is the black bar still stays the same as when they're not depleted. Smoking doesn't have an enhancing effect, so it doesn't bring them up any better than the people that were depleted, whether they smoke. So it rules out kind of cognitive enhancement and more about a restoration. So you have to have some deficit for the smoking to actually be rewarding in that regard. So I also had some additional aims in terms of looking at the mechanisms, so looking at mediators of that relationship in terms of affective types of mediators. And then I also, in the previous study that looked at the effects of self-control depletion on substance use, they didn't find any effects on like urge or cravings or desires to smoke. So I wanted to look at that in a little more detail. And I also wanted to look at how it might affect their smoking behavior, so latency and how many number of puffs they take and kind of how deeply they inhale it, which some people have also conceptualized as kind of their level of motivation to smoke. If they kind of puff on it harder, it's called smoking topography. So typical with our types of studies, we bring people in that are 18 to 65. They tend to be heavy smokers. They're smoking about 20 cigarettes per day, or at least 20 cigarettes. The national average for daily smokers is around 18 or 17. And people that have been kind of smoking at this rate for about a year at least. The carbon monoxide levels verifies that they're smoking at the rate they say they do. And they're not currently people that are participating in any sort of cessation trial, because in this study they're actually smoking, so I don't want to give cigarettes to people that are trying to quit at this point. and definitely don't want to be giving cigarettes to people that might be pregnant. So we rule those out as well. And I made sure to power it so we could actually see the effect sizes that we hope to see. So I stratified by gender and made sure to balance all the cells. The population we came in is a kind of a typical smoking population in terms of they were about 40 years old. They smoked about 24 cigarettes per day. And this Ph.D. is a Fagerstrom test for nicotine dependence. It kind of assesses their behavioral patterns and how that relates to how dependent they might be in terms of like how quickly they smoke when they wake up, and do they smoke in times when they're sick, or in times where it's kind of forbidden, places like or things like that. And a 6 indicates high levels of nicotine dependence there. So they're heavy smokers, and they are smoking at a high rate. They didn't have a high level of education or a very high medium income, and the majority of them were Caucasian or African American. And then we had about 14% that were Latino or Hispanic. So we typically would recruit community participants through newspaper ads or Craigslist. Flyers got a few people here and there, but Craigslist by and far I think was probably our best recruitment method. And basically they called up and we talked to them on the phone and asked them some of the inclusion criteria, and then we told them a little bit about what would happen in the lab, and we told them to smoke about 1 hour before they came in, because we kind of wanted to standardize how long it was that people smoked. They just wanted to make sure that they brought their own cigarettes and a lighter, because we were going to have them smoke actually within the lab. So when they got there, we did informed consent, verified they were a smoker with their carbon monoxide levels. And then, although we told them to smoke 1 hour before, we wanted to make sure that everybody smoked at the exact same time. So we had everybody smoke a cigarette. And we did it through the smoking topography machine that they're going to use later. So we kind of wanted to get them familiar with the machines. So it wasn't just kind of this weird contraption they were using. And I'll show you a picture of it in a second, because it's kind of a little odd. And if you're used to kind of doing this behavior, now you're kind of using a completely different machine to smoke it through. And then we had some baseline measures, and at that point we then found out what condition they were going to be in regarding self-control and smoking manipulations. Did those manipulations and had additional self-report measures throughout that I'll go through here. So this is the crest, it's called. So what it does is basically you put the cigarette in this little holder, and through the pressure that they're pulling as hard as they're smoking, kind of capture how like the maximum puff velocity and the volume that's actually coming out of the smoke. So people that take bigger puffs might be more inclined to, or more interested in smoking, basically, is the theory behind it. So we did that at baseline, and then later on when we allowed them to smoke as well. So typical baseline measures are just kind of demographics and smoking history, like how many times they've quit in the past. And then we did a practice mirror tracing task, which ends up being our dependent variable later, because again, we wanted to just familiarize them with some of the tasks they'd be doing. This original one is a very simple one, so it wasn't something that was impossible. It was actually something that we'd want them to be able to achieve, and it was easy just to get them used to doing it. And then we kind of assessed just their general levels of depression, anxiety, and their impression management, and then kind of their state level affect and urge ratings as well. At that point, we then did the depletion manipulation, which is this really terrible film about death and animals dying. It's really quite bad. Probably had about 10 people cry as a function of it. And it's just not pleasant in general. So it increases people's negative affect ratings, as would be predicted. But it also, the thing we manipulate is that we have some people, basically we say, be stone-faced, don't react to this, don't try to feel anything internally. And then the other group, we just say, be as natural as possible and just kind of watch the video. And then afterwards, we again assessed their affect, their urge, and we did depletion manipulation to see if they actually reported that they suppressed their emotions, and how effortful and fatiguing they thought it was to do so. And then for the smoking, pretty simple. We just had half the people smoke for 3 minutes and the other half not smoke. They just sat there. And then again assessed urge and affect. And then these are pictures of actually what the persistence test looked like. So they actually put their hand in a box that had a mirror, and so everything you do is in the opposite direction. And they had to stay on these very thin lines, and anytime they went off the line, I was standing behind them and said, you got to start over and do this again. Super annoying, I'm sure, for them, and super tiring for me because I was in there for like 20 minutes for 130 people. But it was a task that had previously been related to people's quit history and prospectively predicted whether they would quit as well. So it was typically conceptualized as like a trait measure, and so what I was trying to do was show that you can actually manipulate and change some of these things as well, and it fits within the self-control model that people will do better or worse depending on the context in which they perform the task. So no one ever finished these. It's like impossible. And well, at least it was impossible for 132 people and anyone who'd done it before. So the dependent variable here is really how quick until they gave up. Or I gave them 5 minutes for each one, so the maximum could be 20 minutes. And across those 4 different trials, the one on the left is the practice one. It had a much thicker line and was not as complex of movement, so that was the one that people were able to do. So it had a high reliability between all the 4 different difficult ones that they did at the very end. Preliminary analyses are pretty basic. I just want to make sure there was no baseline differences when they first came in, and there were not on any of the measures. And they also all performed the same on that easy mirror tracing task. And there were really no differences on impression management type measures, and if you controlled for them on any of the subsequent analyses I'll talk about, that didn't have any impact either. Those that were depleted did actually report engaging in the suppression, so that's important. We want them to say that they followed the instructions. And they also said it was more fatiguing as well. And if we just looked at the group that was on the left here, we also showed that this group was showing the depletion effect that we predicted that they would. And then we were showing that if you allowed them to smoke, that it brought it back up. And so these 3 groups ended up being statistically equivalent. This group kind of went down, so it supported our hypothesis that smoking was restoring self-control. And not only that, we found that it did influence affect and urge, but only positive affect ended up mediating this relationship. So smoking was basically functioning through its effects on positive affect modulation and restoring self-control resources. But it again did not have any effect on urge or on any of the smoking related variables that I collected as well in terms of just the effects of self-control depletion on smoking. So I thought this was nice because it provided an internally valid test to kind of show this misregulation. It actually does serve a purpose for the smoker in this context of when they're depleted because it appears to actually restore self-control. And again, it was interesting because it didn't have to do with its effects on negative affect or urge. But it still bothered me that it wasn't influencing like craving or kind of the smoking motivation type measures. So I wanted to kind of study that in a little more detail. And that'll be the next study that I talk about here in a moment. But some of the takeaway messages from the first one here was that this is kind of this novel negative reinforcement pathway. It might kind of extend some of the addiction models that focus just on negative affect to also include the self-control resources that might underlie why people feel stressed. And so I basically, in yellow here, highlighted that it might be this trigger, this cue, that predicts when people are going to smoke. So if we can kind of capture when people are feeling that way, that might be the kind of the next step. But first I wanted to make sure I could actually show this again in the lab and set up a laboratory paradigm where I can start playing with it a little and see if I can intervene to influence that relationship. And so I wanted to kind of use this cessation failure paradigm that was kind of similar to what I was talking about with latency to smoke and puffs, or number of puffs, but this time which provided an incentive not to do that behavior. So fitting with that self-regulation, I wanted to give them a goal or a reason or some incentive not to smoke. So the incentive we used was paying them. And so this was previously used in like medication screening trials. So they can kind of look and get a signal of whether new medications will influence whether they smoke in the lab. And if it passes that, then it might go on to a clinical trial where they actually test it in treatment outcome studies. And I thought this might be a nice time to actually test new precipitants of relapse. And so it was previously used to kind of look at the effects of stress and alcohol and withdrawal, which are all known precipitants of relapse as well. But now I wanted to test and show that self-control depletion might serve a similar role. So just kind of validating that in the model. And I, again, as I said, was a little perturbed that craving never came out, because usually craving and smoking you'd think would be related. If they tell you they want to smoke, you'd think that that would also be predictive of whether they smoke, but people it really had no effect in those previous studies. So I was wondering, is that a function of how we were measuring it? Because there was typically like 1 or 2 single items. And so I kind of gave a broader measure in this subsequent study. And also wanted to see maybe if there's any other alternative types of processes that might be happening outside of conscious awareness. And so that led me to behavioral economics, which kind of used these behavioral tasks to look at people's objective kind of valuation of different products. So not only drug specific, but also just in general, how much they value kind of different rewards. And so these measures have typically been related to substance use and have predicted treatment outcomes and also relapse in the future or in the past. So I wanted to kind of, again, apply these clinical lab models that might have actual utility, hopefully, within the clinic, because you can actually administer these fairly quickly within a couple of minutes. So if we could actually find something that predicts something in the lab, then we might be able to use it clinically as well. So briefly, delayed discounting is really just how much we value this commodity as a function of time. And so people that are considered more impulsive are basically discounting the value of future rewards, whereas it might have more value for people that are willing to wait for it as well. So you just do that through a series of them kind of completing how much they would pick a smaller immediate reward versus a larger later reward and get what's called a K, or their discounting rate. And then this drug demand, or what is kind of captured through purchase tasks, they're called. You basically just say, how many cigarettes would you smoke if they cost $0? How much if they were 5 cents? How much if they were 10 cents? And so price continues to kind of change over time. And as you would predict, following the law of demand, consumption actually decreases as well. But at first, it doesn't have much of an impact. But then there's this big kind of break point where it goes down to 0. And you can kind of get all these different kind of motivational measures. So looking at how quickly the slope changes, or the total slope in general, or just how much they'll smoke when it's free. There's a number of there's 5 different indices actually that you get from these measures. So I wanted to play around with that and see how self-control depletion might influence that as well. And both of those measures, nicotine withdrawal has been found to actually influence and make people more impulsive, and also to make people value cigarettes more. So I wanted to see if that context might also influence the role of self-control. So what I wanted to do is just first test self-control depletion as an antecedent for for that cessation failure paradigm, and also whether it will influence those other potential process variables, and then see if it looks any different when people are nicotine deprived, or when they're just in a satiated state. So I plan to also test the mediation model that self-control depletion would actually influence impulsive decision-making through delayed discounting, and then also the reward value of the product. And then I was still not sure if craving was going to come out, because 3 previous studies have shown that it really has no influence. One interesting thing is that in those 3 prior studies, all participants were in satiated state, so they had all just previously used the substance readily, and so they weren't in actual withdrawal. So I thought maybe withdrawal might play a role there as well. So again, I used a 2x2 cross-factorial design, and the variables manipulated were nicotine deprivation and self-control depletion. And so this time I had 128 people come in, again, stratified by gender. Again, they were heavy smokers, about 20 cigarettes per day. And again, still a high nicotine dependent score of 5.6. And again, kind of about 40 years old, and tend to be a lower education and income that they had as well. And similarly, a majority of Caucasian and African American individuals. So to look at the actual procedures, the people that were nicotine deprived, I had them not smoke for 12 hours before they came in, which is not fun for a smoker that's smoking about 20 cigarettes per day, which on average is about 44 minutes if they're sleeping about 8 hours in a night. So it's going a lot longer than they typically would. And when they come in, they report wanting a cigarette, and they report feeling stressed and irritable and difficulties concentrating, the typical nicotine withdrawal symptoms. The other people just smoked normally, as they typically would. They were much happier when they came in. And then they kind of did their informed consent. They filled out some baseline measures, similar to what I talked about before. They did the exact same self-controlled depletion manipulation where they watched that video. And then I did a brief assessment that I'll discuss in a moment. And then I did that cessation failure task where they could sit there and be paid not to smoke. And then they were able to go home. So those baseline measures were very similar to the measures I previously mentioned. I also threw in glucose utilization, so measuring their blood glucose levels, trying to pick up and see whether there'd be some relationship between blood glucose and smoking as well. And then I used a longer and more multi-dimensional tobacco craving questionnaire at this point. Then after they did the depletion task, again, I got affect and how much they were doing the emotional suppression and how fatiguing they found it to be, and also tested their glucose to see if glucose levels changed as a function of doing these emotional suppression tasks. And then just also assessed the craving and the delayed discounting and the cigarette demand as well. So again, I wanted to make sure there was equivalence across conditions and the baseline variables. And then I wanted to kind of do the ANCOVAs and MANCOVAs to look at some of the dependent variables as well, and then follow that up with mediation analyses as well. So the people that were supposed to not smoke came in, and they had lower CO levels, as you'd expect, because they just weren't inhaling a combustible product. If they had a higher level than a 10, we sent them home and allowed them to come in another day, and basically told them that they need to not smoke in order to have a lower number. So it's a pretty easy biochemical verification. And those that ended up not smoking ended up showing, as I said, a lot higher nicotine withdrawal symptoms as well. And similar to the past study, those that were depleted also said that they followed the instructions to suppress their emotions, and they also said that it was more effortful, difficult, and fatiguing. But similar to the literature, there was no differences in actual affective ratings. And although 6 prior studies showed that glucose levels drop as a function of doing these suppression tasks, I didn't find a signal for that. Although I did, as a caveat, a lot of people, in order to get that signal, you typically have to have the person not consume any other glucose products or eat or drink anything, basically, for 2 or 3 hours for glucose levels to stabilize, because there's a big spike right after you eat in about an hour. So the people that actually followed those instructions, the signal looked a little bit more clear and consistent with actually what the prior studies had shown. But I didn't make it a requirement that they didn't eat for those 3 hours. I just asked them to do it. And those that complied, it looked like it was actually showing it. But what we did find is actually a main effect for the self-control depletion on latency to smoke. So when they could sit there and earn $1 for every 5 minutes that they didn't smoke, people would forego that money if you depleted them of self-control, or if you just, there was also a main effect for deprivation. So if you hadn't smoked for 12 hours, you were willing to give up that money quicker. But you were also more likely to give that up even after a 6-minute manipulation of just suppressing your emotions. So I found that really, really intriguing, that something's just so short-acting could have similar effects. And the effect size is actually fairly similar, or is similar. But it didn't have any effects on the section where they could actually smoke as many cigarettes as they want. And they were sitting there with 8 cigarettes in front of them. So on average, I think they smoked about 2 or 3 in an hour. But there were no differences between any of the conditions there. So basically, it impacted how quickly they started smoking, but not how much they smoked afterwards. And in terms of the mediation models, I used the univariate models to basically identify which mediators I wanted to use. So nicotine deprivation actually had an influence on craving and discounting and drug demand, whereas self-control depletion actually did not have any impact on those variables. So in the nicotine deprivation model, mediation actually ended up only being observed through craving in parallel mediation models like I had shown in that original figure. But interestingly, when people were deprived and you depleted them of self-control, that's where craving actually had the biggest impact. So craving had no kind of effect on people that were satiated or had just recently smoked, but it actually ended up mediating the relationship between self-control depletion and smoking amongst those that were actually deprived. So I was really kind of positive of the fact that I was able to replicate a lot of the nicotine deprivation effects in terms of the effects on craving and the effects on discounting, which had been found in 4 prior studies, and the effects on demand, which had been found in 1 prior study. And so that made me think that at least the measures I'm using are working the way other labs have found. And so the fact that self-control depletion ended up showing similar effects on the cessation failure paradigm provide some validity that it might be this potential relapse precipitant that is newly identified, basically. It might function differently when people are in a state that's more likely to represent someone trying to quit, which is when they're deprived of nicotine. So the first 2 weeks post-cessation is really the worst times when people report nicotine withdrawal symptoms, and then they tend to get better and recover over time. Although some people can actually experience them for up to a month and even longer, and those tend to be the people that actually relapse at higher rates. But it basically showed that things might be functioning differently for those that were deprived and those that weren't, and also that nicotine deprivation might have different effects than self-control depletion. So I was also a little surprised that self-control depletion didn't actually impact delayed discounting, which is supposed to be this level of impulsivity. So it's not necessarily that self-control and impulsivity are the exact, or I guess 2 sides to the same coin. They might be actually different processes going on that might be acting through different functions or different processes. And although craving came out to be a critical mediator for the deprived participants, it really didn't play much of a role when people were kind of currently satiated, which again fits back to these, maybe people are smoking before craving arises or before some of those symptoms arise to kind of stave off cravings in terms of the unconscious processes that underlie or might maintain smoking behavior. So if smoking is restoring self-control and allowing us not to feel bad, then we don't necessarily ever have to feel the craving state, basically. So to me, I'm thinking this might be, if self-control does end up working out in the real world as well, these are all lab studies, that might provide some evidence that we should be monitoring self-control, which is not really an easy process at this point because we're not necessarily sure how to monitor it in the best way. But if we could, through EMA or through other alternative methods, that could allow us to predict when people are going to relapse in the future. We might also want to try to provide people alternative restoration strategies in lieu of smoking behavior, because if you provide that restoration, maybe smoking might not be as reinforcing anymore. You don't need it to be your coping strategy. You have something else to deal with these depleted resources. So again, going back to the areas where there's literature to support positive affect relaxation and glucose, there's actually research within the smoking literature that those can be strategies that are actually helpful at reducing smoking cessation. So maybe that's the mechanism through which they work. And maybe we can apply some of these short-acting types of manipulations to smokers in those high-risk situations. There's also one study that did self-control training so that if you practice self-control strategies, like monitoring, the study this did was just monitoring your posture, for example, for a week. So you're just doing one little thing that changes because it requires a little bit of conscious, deliberative control to think about what my posture is for over the course of a week, versus someone who is just monitoring, their general day-to-day activities. And they found that people that changed their behavior or monitored and kind of changed their self-posture actually were able to quit smoking at higher rates. So this very simple type of training And they've applied it in other studies in different contexts. So basically they try to apply it to, again, like a muscle. If you work out for a week, well, maybe not a week, but if you work out for a period of time, you're going to have more strength available to deal with in the future. So it might kind of make your resource pool bigger so that a little hit might not have as much of an impact as if you had a smaller pool to start from, basically. And so no study has ever kind of tested both of those in combination. So can we build people up before they quit, and then can we give them some tools after they quit? And so there might be some self-control based interventions that could be in the future that combine those. On the mechanistic side, I always like to think about what might be happening or what's kind of underlying some of these processes. So there's now kind of a lot of theories showing that it might not be that there is this resource necessarily that we can measure, or this little pool, but it might be that it affects people's motivational desire. So we might kind of be less inclined to do something if we're not rewarded for it, if it requires more effort. So changing kind of how people view the opportunity costs of it. And there might be different kind of processes going on at the cognitive or neurocognitive level to measure it as well. So up there are some kind of candidate variables where there's some evidence that it might actually be a measure of it. So it's still kind of a fuzzy picture of whether there actually is this resource, whether we can measure it, or whether we need to be kind of thinking about it in a different way. But behaviorally, it all still kind of comes out kind of having the similar impact. It's just these underlying processes we're not quite sure. So I could try to parse that out in a little more detail, because I think the better we know about something, the better we can intervene, because we know exactly what we're trying to push around. But also, again, I've only done any of this in the context of a lab-based study. And what I want to do is really get out into the real world and see if we can capture self-control depletion. And so some ways of doing that might be through EMA, and trying to capture that through cell phones, and then trying to provide potential interventions. So there was one study that recently came out that tried to create a resource depletion scale, or resource depletion score, basically, by saying they randomly prompted people like 7 times a day and said, did you resist or try to control any urges or desires over the past hour? And they did it across about 14 different contexts. So, for example, did you resist wanting to eat or wanting to drink or wanting to check your email? You've all done a great job on that one, by the way. And social contact, using Facebook, not paying attention in class, whatever it might be. And they kind of plotted out how frequently that desire occurred, and also how strong those desires were. And then they kind of put all this together to create kind of this resource depletion score over the course of a day. And so the more this kind of score increased, the more they were actually going to engage in a self-control deficit, basically, or engage in the actual behavior. So this wasn't actually in smokers. This was just in anybody who signed up for the study. So you might see tobacco is only a small circle there, because the bigger the circle is, actually the more the greater frequency that happens. So actually eating was the biggest one, or wanting to sleep or take a nap. So tobacco wasn't that important, but in this context. But if you actually manage smokers, I think that would be a much bigger circle and probably higher desires as well. So I'd like to actually apply those methods with smokers as well, and look at what resources they had available. With the general theme going towards trying to create ecological momentary interventions where we can actually monitor people before they try to make a cessation attempt, and think about the context. So a lot of what I talked about were kind of internal processes, but all of these happen within the context of locations and our environment. So we actually can now use our phones to capture geospatial data. There's all sorts of actually programs and apps on this that are like an accelerometer. I can see how fast I'm moving, or I can see the ambient light that's in the room, or I can actually detect sounds and things like that. So there's studies that are kind of using that information to kind of relate. If you do that combined with EMA, you can kind of see different contexts in which people are feeling stressed or feeling better, or when they're feeling cravings. And you might be able to actually predict when those states are going to happen in the future if I end up being at the same location at the same time with the same level of activity or something like that. and then you can actually deliver these types of interventions that I was talking about earlier. So I could envision kind of different levels of research taking place where you're in the lab coming up with those treatments you can deliver while also trying to develop these in other types of studies, and then all of it coming together in the future. And they're starting to apply some of these using basically what's called this machine learning algorithms that can kind of predict those subjective states and then deliver the intervention automatically. And another strength of this is that you can actually personalize it. So, you know, that's one of the kind of really big picture type things in any health behavioral medicine is how can we make this more applicable to the actual patient as they're coming in. So in the models that they've tested is when you actually look at across all people's responses, you have much lower predictive validity than if you would just look at the idiographic data and actually could use one individual person's. Because, I mean, if you're trying to tell people not to smoke when they drink, that wouldn't make sense if you're giving that to somebody, for example, that doesn't drink, or if you're, so you want to kind of know what the cues are for that individual person. And I think the technology is available to do it now. It's just a matter of putting it all together. And at risk of being a crazy cat guy, I'd like to say thank you all for listening, and happy holidays. Thanks for sticking around for the talk. Yeah, what's up, Connor?
I have a question. I think the lack of relationship between self-control, like depleted self-control resources and impulsivity, is interesting. And I know that you said that self-regulation is just a really kind of a broad area. I'm wondering if the lack of relationship between self-control, depletion, and impulsivity on this kind of task could be a function of the way that you depleted self-control resources. More of a depletion of like emotional resources rather than maybe physical resources, and if you review something like the food task where you're not letting them choose those different foods, and that had to do with discounting task, that there might be a relationship there, or what do you think about that?
I think that's an awesome question, and the answer is I do think it's probably task specific. Just as a function of, there's evidence, Warren Bickel actually has a paper called like the antipodes of executive functions and impulsivity. And emotional avoidance, which I would consider the emotional suppression, is the only one that didn't have that correlation, or the negative correlation with discounting measures, whereas other executive function type tasks actually did have that relationship. And well, that actually, yeah. So I think it probably is task specific, and I'm not entirely sure how to explain it at this point, but I think it's great to think about. Yep.
You buy into the glucose depletion model of self-control, and whether you do or don't, why do you think it is that self-regulatory mechanism appears to display the properties of a limited capacity resource?
Yeah, so the more I think, so I don't necessarily think it's as simple as blood glucose, and the fact that you can just rinse your mouth, and so you haven't actually ingested glucose into your blood can have the exact same effect as if you drank it and let it kind of get in your system. So I think that's probably more of, it actually sparks the motivational pathway, or the dopaminergic kind of system. So that kind of goes to the motivational account. So it's really just giving people like, oh, you might have these resources available. So it's kind of, from an evolutionary perspective, it's telling people that you're about to have resources. So it might actually be tricking people. But from a behavioral level or operant conditioning, you could also think of glucose as a reward. It's a natural reinforcer. And some of the other things I listed were natural reinforcers. So positive moods are good. So you're giving people a reward after this. It requires more effort to do a task, and then you reward somebody. And cigarettes are actually a reward as well. So maybe they're just more willing to do the next task. Again, speaking to a motivational account. So I'm kind of switching more towards the motivational than necessarily this physiological underpinning per se.
A better answer to that question I got from Roy Baumeister when I asked it.
All right, I'll take it. I'm done here. Any other questions?